2. The law and the ban. A very important declaration, which is a part of the declared law, is Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 9 to 15. Know therefore that the Lord thy God, he is God, the faithful God, which keepeth covenant and mercy with them that love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations, and repayeth them that hate him to their face, to destroy them. He will not be slack to him that hateth him. He will repay him to his face. Thou shalt therefore keep the commandments, and the statutes, and the judgments which I command thee this day to do them. Wherefore it shall come to pass, if ye hearken to these judgments, and keep and do them, that the Lord thy God shall keep unto thee the covenant and the mercy which he sware unto thy fathers. And he will love thee, and bless thee, and multiply thee. He will also bless the fruit of thy womb, and the fruit of thy land, thy corn, and thy wine, and thine oil, the increase of thy kine, and the flocks of thy sheep, in the land which he sware unto thy fathers to give thee. Thou shalt be blessed above all people. There shall not be male or female barren among you, or among your cattle. And the Lord will take away from thee all sickness, and will put none of the evil diseases of Egypt, which thou knowest, upon thee, but will lay them upon all them that hate thee. First, while this is a part of covenant law, its application is not restricted to Israel. The covenant circumscribes all men without exception. The original covenant was with Adam. The renewed covenant was with Noah. All men are either covenant keepers or covenant breakers. All men are thus inescapably tied to the covenant and its promises of love and hate, blessings and curses. Christ, in renewing the covenant, made it clear that all men were involved in it. According to John chapter 12, verses 32 and 33, And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me. This he said, signifying what death he should die. By becoming the sacrifice, the priest, and the divine renewer of the covenant of God with man, Jesus would draw all men to him, that is, become the principle of judgment and of salvation, of curses and of blessings. The covenants and the law of the covenant, as well as the Lord of the covenant, thus judge every man. Second, the covenant God identifies himself as God, the faithful God, which means, in Wright's words, that he alone is sovereign Lord, and he is reliable, trustworthy. What he has said he will do. An aspect of God's trustworthiness is his jealousy, his wrath, hate, and judgment of those who despise his covenant and law. God promises love and hate as an aspect of his absolute justice and faithfulness. Third, this means retribution. He promises to repay those who hate him by destroying them. He does not delay with those who hate him, but repays them personally. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 10, Berkeley version. Thus, retribution is an aspect of God's law which men must apply, because it is first of all God's principle of operation which he applies. Those whom he loves, that is, those who obey his covenant law, he blesses with fertility of womb, of land, of flocks and herds, of freedom from the notorious evil diseases of Egypt. Fourth, God asserts his sovereign rights. In verse 12, he refers to his judgments, as W.L. Alexander has pointed out. Judgments, that is, rights, rightful claims. God, as the great king, has his rights, and these are to be rendered to him by his subjects and servants. Kyle and Delitzsch interpreted judgments in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 1 to mean rights, all that was due to them, whether in relation to God or to their fellow men. However, God's law is an assertion of God's righteousness and rights over mankind. Secondarily, because man is God's creature, his only true rights are in God and God's law. It is interesting to note that one of the Greek New Testament words for judgment is crisis, which means a separating and then a decision. The law and the judgment of the law is a declaration of God's rightful claims, his rights over all men. Hence, his right to love and to hate them in terms of their reaction to his rights. Fifth, as already noted, fertility and abundance are promised to all who are obedient to God's covenant law. To the degree that even an ungodly man respects God's law, to that degree he flourishes. Nations rise and fall in terms of this fact. Disobedience, on the other hand, leads to judgment. This brings us to a point of especial importance. It was stated earlier that the covenant circumscribes all men without exception. Covenant keepers are blessed, and covenant breakers are cursed. This is apparent in the ban which precedes and follows Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 9 to 15, verses 1 to 8, and verses 16 to 26. Israel was called upon to cast out and destroy the inhabitants of the land, because now their iniquity was full. Genesis chapter 15, verse 16. The whole point of the ban was that these Canaanite peoples were morally offensive to God. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 to 18. The ban could be issued only by God, not by man. By the ban, God declared a people to be outside the law and under sentence of death. The ban is the reverse of communion, and it declares the end of communion with God and man. The banned people are given over to death as their judgment. Communion and community can exist where there are strong personal differences and enmity. Van der Leeuw cites a good example of this. Today, the finest example is still a peasant who has no feelings, but simply belongs to his community, as contrasted with the citoyen, invented in the 18th century. Even peasants who fight or engage in lawsuits remain neighbours and brothers. A peasant in the eastern Netherlands who has a mortal enemy in the village nevertheless knows that on market days he is obliged to greet his foe and walk up and down with him once. When the peasant community of the whole district is gathered in the country town, thus demonstrating to the eyes of strangers the fellowship of the village ad oculus. The point in such a custom is this: disagreement exists, lawsuits are in process, but such differences are a part of life in a community and a form of community. Thus, differences are inescapable in every marriage. With godly people, the differences serve to increase the areas of communion and agreement by bringing problems to the surface for settlement. A community requires dissension and disagreements in order to progress. The ban, instead, means the end of community. It indicates a situation beyond disagreement. It means that the curse has taken over. The relationship of community and disagreement is well illustrated by an incident in a small California farm area in 1970. A woman, notorious for her brawling and argumentative ways, tried to start a major argument with Mrs. E.S., whom she had met only once before. Mrs. S., with a superb feminine logic and wisdom, walked out on her, observing, "Don't pick a fight with me. I don't know you that well." Her point was well taken. There was no community whatsoever between them, and thus no ground whatsoever for any communication or any disagreement. The ban is more than the absence of community. It is, rather, the end of all community, of any possible agreement or disagreement. The Jewish custom of reading the service of the dead over a member of the family who has transgressed beyond a certain point is a very sound one. The person is then under the ban. Where the ban validly exists, there the curse takes over. In the curse, man invokes God to judge a man or people he regards beyond communion, whose sins require total judgment. God will not hearken to an undeserved curse, as in the case of Balaam. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 5, where he turned the curse into a blessing. The causeless curse accomplishes nothing. Proverbs chapter 26, verse 2. When God pronounces the curses which appear in the law and the epilogue to the law upon disobedience, he is thus placing all such persons under the ban. The law forbids us from cursing certain persons. We are forbidden, in Exodus chapter 22, verse 28, to curse rulers or the gods or judges, or to curse parents, Exodus chapter 21, verse 17, or the deaf, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 14. This does not mean the alternative is servile obedience, but it does forbid us to curse superior authorities or the helpless. God himself pronounces curses on godless authorities. The fact of the ban and of curses thus makes clear that the scope of the law is beyond the realm of Israel or the Church. God, as the creator of all men, intends his law to govern all men. All men are thus liable to judgment and death for disobedience to the law of God. The Talmud, in dealing with land laws, insisted on God's ownership of the earth. Because of God's total lordship and sovereignty, the land, even in the hands of heathens, is under God's jurisdiction. The heathen thus are accountable, according to the Talmud, to God for the care of the earth under law and for the payment of the tithe. It is fashionable for many, quote, Christians, end quote, to express their contempt for the Talmud. Despite its many vagaries, at this point, and elsewhere, the Talmud gave better practical recognition to the sovereignty of God than did Luther, Calvin, and many others. Luther, having denied the law of God, pushed his hostility to the point of denying everything associated with it, including the Jews and the Talmud. Having denied the law of God, Lutheranism then had to deny the victory promised by that law. Accordingly, in the Augsburg Confession, Article 17, in the last paragraph, It declared of the Lutheran churches that they condemn others also who now scatter Jewish opinions that, before the resurrection of the dead, the godly shall occupy the kingdom of the world, the wicked being everywhere suppressed. The saints alone, the pious, shall have a worldly kingdom, and shall exterminate all the godless. The movement of the Church so charted is from victory to defeat. Luther himself began with victory and ended in defeat, a self-tortured, guilt-ridden and bloated man. He who had been the hope of the Christian poor had been denounced by them as Herr Luder, Mr. Liar, Decoy, Law Scoundrel, or Carrion. Luther could rightfully plead that his was not a theology of social revolution, but he had raised false hopes among the peasants. Sola Scriptura was his standard, the Word of God alone. This, to the people, meant not only justification by faith, but also the sovereign law of God. To that law they appealed, and Luther denounced God's law in favour of statist law. Melanchthon did not betray Luther when he constructed a new doctrine of natural law based on Aristotle and biblical theology, which, in many respects, is identical with that of St. Thomas. The similarity to Thomism was not accidental. Having denounced God's law, the only alternative was Thomism and natural law. The Reformation was thus stillborn. Lutheranism has maintained the standard, sola scriptura, but it has denied the validity of God's law. It has, more than any other church, discouraged interest in the book of Revelation, since that book so emphatically declares the total relevancy of God and His law to this world. If the people were to read too much on Revelation, a crisis of faith might arise, and the people might call their church Lutheran instead of Lutheran. Calvin also made possible the revival of natural law by his loose views of the law of God. The Puritans, for a time, saved Calvinism from itself by their emphasis on biblical law, only to succumb themselves to the intellectual climates of Neoplatonism and also the lure of the natural law. The Reformation as a whole moved from victory to defeat, from relevance to irrelevance, from a challenge to the world to a surrender to the world or a meaningless withdrawal from it. Rome, Geneva, Wittenberg, and Canterbury retreated also into an ineffectual pietism. They were all now of the world, but not in the world. To forsake the law is to forsake the blessing and victory which the law confers upon all who are obedient. Pagan nations which reject God but still are in obedience to some of His laws, maintaining true family order, observing laws concerning murder, theft and false witness, and also respecting the laws concerning the use of the earth, such nations prosper and flourish to the degree of their obedience. Great nations have arisen as a result of the discipline of the law and have fallen on forsaking it. If to forsake the law is to forsake victory and blessing, and to keep the law is to prosper and flourish, and if this be true for pagan nations, how much more so for the godly? If a people acknowledge Jesus Christ as Lord and King, and obey His sovereign law, their blessing and victory will be all the greater. Even as, in lawlessness and unbelief, their condemnation will surpass all others.